This is Jerry Barrett talking. Today's date is April 24th, 1986. I'm interviewing David Kunstler in his office at Eastern Airline headquarters in Miami. David, would you begin by just talking a little bit about what you did before you came with Eastern Airlines?
Well, as I said, Jerry, we're going back a long way. I joined Eastern in the fall of 1963. I graduated college in 1955. I spent 3 years in the Navy, in the aviation branch. Although I wasn't a pilot, I was an airborne air controller and an anti-submarine warfare expert or something like that. I flew in the right seat of carrier-based anti-submarine aircraft. So there really wasn't too much of a gap between finishing my time in the military and joining Eastern. It was about 4 years, and my first job was on Wall Street. And I actually did become a registered representative and attempted to sell stock. I didn't really enjoy that too much because I found myself in a position of recommending securities to people that I didn't know very much about. I then took a job with a company called the Victorine Instrument Company, which was a mini conglomerate. It was listed on the American Stock Exchange, and it had a number of subsidiaries in very diverse businesses. The basic company, Victorine itself, made nuclear measuring instruments, radiometers and things like that. But it owned a plastic sign company in Kokomo, Indiana. It owned a felt company out on the West Coast and a capacitor company in Chicago. And my job took me to these subsidiaries where I was sort of a representative of the home office, and I worked in these companies for a while, and I lived in Chicago for a while, and I lived in Kokomo, Indiana for a while. After a few years of that, and I had recently gotten married, I decided I really didn't like those folks too much. And I came to Florida not knowing what I was going to do. And I looked around here for a while, and just by chance, and it's kind of funny how chance shapes your life, someone who lived in the same apartment building asked me had I ever considered working for the airlines, because they were friendly with someone, I believe it was the vice president of personnel at Eastern back in those years. And I said no, because that wasn't really what I had come to Florida for. But not having a job for several months, I decided that perhaps I ought to go see what it was all about. And I came out here for an interview, and I was offered a job in the revenue accounting department. I was a math major in college, and I had taken a few graduate courses in accounting. And when I accepted the job, I really thought that it was going to be an interim thing until I found something that I really wanted to pursue. And as I said, that was 23 years ago, and I really haven't looked for anything since. And the reason is that this is just a fascinating company in a fascinating industry, and I don't think I have ever spent a dull day here at Eastern Airlines. So that covers it.
Well, the fascinating part of it is certainly true of the past 10 years. But was it in those early years as well?
Sure.
Uh-huh.
Oh, sure. Aviation, even when we were a regulated industry, it was an interesting and a very challenging business. And Eastern was always particularly challenging. I guess your question is, why do I feel that way? I guess most of it stems from the public interest in the business. You know, if you own a shoe store, there aren't many people who really care about the intricacies of the shoe business. But when you're a part of aviation, and this was just as true back in the 60s as it has been in the 80s, your work impacted a lot of people, and they were interested in your work. And the challenges were always very great. You know, sure, today we can literally do anything we want to do in the domestic marketplace, so your ideas become tested in the marketplace. In the 60s, when you wanted to do something, when you wanted to take some initiative, you had to find a way to sell it to the Civil Aeronautics Board, but that was challenging too, and you were still trying to make your ideas work. And then when they did work, they impacted literally millions of people. So I have always found that to be very rewarding.
You can make a contrast between the earlier management and the current as well.
Several managements.
Yes. Okay. Yes. That's right.
I actually, when I joined Eastern, it was really the end of the Eddie Rickenbacker era. He was still chairman of the board. A gentleman whom I never met, Malcolm McIntyre, was president. And a couple of months after I joined, Floyd Hall came to Eastern as, I guess he was president. He came as president. McIntyre left. And that was really the start of the Hall era, which lasted from 63 to 75.
Okay.
Now, under Hall, when Captain Eddie retired, Hall became chairman of the board, and then in that roughly 12-year period, there were several presidents, including Hall himself, because on a couple of occasions when a president would leave, he took back that title as well, and he was chairman and president, and then he would appoint a new president and just be chairman. I had some, I guess, some unusual insight into this process, because in 1966, I moved to New York to join the staff of a gentleman named Art Lewis, who was executive vice president and general manager of the airline. And about a year after that, I became his assistant. And in fact, I was his assistant on the day in 1969 when he resigned. So I had a fairly close view of workings at the senior level back 20 years ago.
Oh, yes. Okay. Has that changed much?
It's hard to distinguish between whether the process has changed or whether I've changed. I have a very different view of it. Certainly, the Borman style was, very, very different than the Floyd Hall style. Floyd was a very formal man, and did things in a very deliberate fashion, where I think Frank is a much more intuitive individual, and does things in a much less formal way, and perhaps much more quickly than Floyd ever did things. I would have to say that that the Floyd Hall style might not have been very effective in today's much more fast-moving environment. So frank style is certainly appropriate for a deregulated environment.
Mm.
You don't have time to study things to death. But then, there were others. There was a fellow named Sam Higginbottom who was president of the airline for a couple of years under Floyd Hall, and I worked closely with him too.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You held a variety of jobs. Can you talk a little bit about the ones leading up to your current job? As I understand it, you're senior vice president.
Planning.
Planning. Okay.
Well, as I said, I started out in revenue accounting, and not too long thereafter I became manager of financial analysis, and then I moved to New York doing financial work for the executive VP and general manager, Arthur Lewis. That involved budgets primarily because he was responsible for all of the operating divisions. When he resigned, I guess that really was when I was offered a pretty good opportunity. For a couple of weeks I came to work and really didn't know what I was going to do. I was assistant to a departed president. But then the senior VP of marketing, a fellow named Tom McFadden, called me into his office one day and told me that he really wasn't happy with the way reservations was running, and would I be interested in becoming vice president of reservations. He further told me that they were in the process of moving reservations headquarters to Miami, and would that bother me? And of course I had been trying to figure out a way to get back to Miami for 3 years. So it was probably one of the greatest days of my life, because I became an officer of the company and I was told to move back to where I wanted to move, which was great. That was a marvelous experience. I didn't know anything about reservations. I think the reservations people are probably the core of this business, because the reservations function is very unique to the airline business. I think there's a lot of parallels. Maintenance accounting can be the same in a lot of businesses, but reservations per se is a very specific airline function. And there is no place where you can learn more about what goes on in the airline, because everything that happens impacts reservations, because that is the interface with the consumer. Mm-hmm. So I started my career in reservations by going to school, the same school, for whatever it was, 6 weeks, that a res agent would go through, because I wanted to understand how to make reservations, mm-hmm. and how to, in fact, I even took a few phone calls from the public and made bookings and so on. The other thing about it that I enjoyed so much is that you could experiment, you could try things. If you wanted to try to sell harder or try a certain sales pitch, you could have one team of res agents try that approach, and then you could monitor the results. I did that for 3 years, and then Wes Caldall, who now has the same job I have here at American, he left to go to American. He was then vice president of schedules, and I believe at that point, if my memory serves me, it was 1971, 72, Sam Higginbottom was president, and Sam offered me that job as vice president of schedules. Again, the only thing I knew about schedules is what I had picked up by being involved with reservations, so I started over again trying to learn about scheduling airplanes. I did that for about 3 years. And in 1975, when Borman took over, I moved into the marketing area, and I became vice president of sales and advertising, which was again somewhat of a new thrill. And I really did that for the better part of 8 or 9 years. The title changed, some of the responsibilities changed, but essentially I was deeply involved in the marketing programs, dealing with travel agencies, designing fair programs. I was heavily involved in our travel agency computer system, SOTA, when we decided to launch that in 1980. A couple of years ago, off the record, I had some differences with the senior vice president of marketing, and it really became very difficult for me to continue in the job that I was in. And I guess I owe this to Frank, because the differences were severe enough where I was prepared to leave the company if that had to happen. But he offered me kind of a holding job, if you will. I was responsible for buying and selling airplanes and a few other miscellaneous things. And I did that for about 1.5 years, and last July, when Mort Ehrlich, who was Senior VP of Planning, resigned, and actually Russ Ray, who was Senior VP of Marketing, resigned on the same day, Frank offered me this position, so that's where I am.
What do you do in planning?
Planning really in an airline involves 3 major components. Where do you fly? What schedules do you operate? And what prices do you charge? And of course that is supported by what airplanes do you operate, because fleet planning is one of our responsibilities, although that is not really a continuing thing because you don't buy airplanes every day, but you do need to have a plan as to what you would like to have, and then of course the question of your financial ability to buy them. But the schedule, the route and schedule responsibility, particularly in a deregulated environment where you can fly anywhere you want to, is an ongoing responsibility, and probably the most massive or challenging responsibility of all these days is the pricing responsibility, which I feel that I share. Although I have the tariff department, I work very closely with John Nelson in marketing on fair programs, and with Wayne Yeoman in finance, who keeps us honest that we don't give away the store. There are some other pieces too. For example, capacity control has become a very significant airline function, and that's where, instead of having a single price in the coach section of an airplane, you have a multitude of prices, and somebody has to decide how many cheap seats you have to sell in order to fill up the airplane. Obviously, you prefer to sell as few as you can. So that is really a real-time exercise, and every day you have to look at something like 1,400 flight segments out for several weeks and decide whether you have your capacity levels set it properly. We're very fortunate here at Eastern because we probably have the top guy in the business who works in my group, who is just a computer genius and has a tremendous capacity for analytical work and just work in general. And I enjoy tremendously, working with him and problem solving with him, and just a delightful guy. His name is Scotty Oughton, by the way, if you get a chance to talk to him.
You're dealing with such a tremendous amount of data, and it would have to be computerized, and then even after that there'd be an analysis problem, wouldn't there? Yes.
Well, to Scotty's credit, initially this was all done manually, and that was very difficult. He's now got it so that it is computerized, it is real time, the computer reacts to changing conditions, but there's still some manual intervention by exception.
In the time that you've been with Eastern, certainly the deregulation has been the most dramatic external thing that's happened, isn't it?
Yeah, sure. I don't think any of us realized quite how dramatic it was going to be at the time, because it has been fairly gradual. The law was passed in 1978, so that's 8 years, and we're still in transition. We're still going through what historians someday will call the Great Transition.
Did Eastern take a position initially against deregulation when it was being discussed in Washington?
Oh, sure, absolutely. If Frank, of course, was at the forefront of this, and he freely admits that he argued strongly against it. He was primarily concerned whether Eastern, with a fairly weak balance sheet, could survive in a fully deregulated environment. But after it happened, and having operated under deregulation for a number of years, he is now convinced that it is, was the right way to go. I guess I share that conviction. I have a few reservations. For one thing, I think that this was a pretty good industry even in the regulated days. We did not overcharge people. We were a consumer-oriented. When they used to take surveys back in the early 70s about how consumers felt about different businesses, whom they trusted, whom they didn't trust. At the bottom end, you would always find used car dealers and that sort of thing. And at the top end would be airlines. They didn't feel that we were abusing our franchises.
Mm-hmm.
We did provide service to communities in cases where we knew it wasn't going to be profitable, because we felt we had that kind of responsibility. We did initiate some low fares. They took longer to materialize, but there were a lot of, Family Plan came in the regulated days. One that I was involved in 15 years ago, we allowed people to go from Miami to New York for $79 round trip if they would travel on certain days and so on. Now, all of these things had to be blessed by the Civil Aeronautics Board, but we got some of them through. So I don't think, as a regulated industry, that we had anything to apologize for.
Mm-hmm.
Now, under deregulation, the industry's become much more competitive. I have to confess that there are a lot more good deals around for consumers. The price that I think the marketplace has paid for that, is there's a lot of confusion. Whether that will all settle down and be less confusing, probably, after a while. But we're still going through that stage where it is very difficult to probably to make a good purchase decision when you buy an airline ticket, and it is particularly difficult to be a middleman, such as a travel agent or a reservations agent, even if you work for an airline, to provide thoughtful advice to the consumer on airline pricing these days is a monumental chore. And that wasn't true, 10 years ago.
Just too many choices, really, for the average consumer to deal with it.
Tremendous amount of choices, and the fare structures are terribly complex. And in some cases, the computer, thank God for computers. I don't think we could have the kind of fare structures we have or do the kind of things we do if we didn't have electronic support. Mm-hmm. There's no way that paper could keep up with what's going on today.
Wasn't the Eastern Shuttle to New York, Washington, Boston, that was another fare innovation that...
Well, it was really a whole service innovation, and that took place in a regulated environment. The shuttle, I believe, was started in 1959 or 60. It was a couple of years before my time at Eastern. And it was an idea, in a sense, born out of a problem, because we had some old airplanes, old Constellations lying around, and someone got the idea that this would be a good use for them. And it's turned out probably to be the most successful airline service ever offered.
And it really did come from that opportunity of having planes that were...
You see, the shuttle is very wasteful of airplanes. You don't get proper utilization out of the number of airplanes that you have to devote to the shuttle. So if you had to go out and buy brand new airplanes, today they may be 20 million, in those days they were 3 million, but it was a lot of money, then you couldn't justify charging competitive fares. Mm-hmm. But if you have fully depreciated airplanes, particularly on the backup sections, the prime section airplanes, you don't get good utilization, but you get reasonable utilization. But the backup airplanes, you can get 2 hours a day. You can't take a $20 million airplane and use it 2 hours a day. So in a sense, the shuttle was born out of someone's idea of how to solve a problem. A lot of good ideas come that way.
Mm-hmm. The move from another major thing that happened during the period you've been with Eastern is the move from headquarters in New York, headquarters to Miami. Has that made a big difference? I mean, I know you already stated your preference where you want to live, right?
Well, I led the parade because I moved down here. My group, the reservations group, back in 1969, was I think the first of the departments to move from New York to Miami. But that was a gradual transition. It all didn't move at once, and there was a core here. The operating side of it was here already. It had been here before my time.
Go ahead.
This was the maintenance base, and I believe flight operations was based here, and customer services was based here. What was in New York was finance, marketing, reservations. That's pretty much it. Mm. Treasury, a piece of finance. There had been an earlier move when a lot of them moved down from New York, and that was, in the 50s, and that was, I'm not too familiar with that.
So the Borman, in making the decision to move south, was really just following a trend of within the corporation of moving some operations south.
My recollection is that really Floyd made the decision. Floyd pretty much had moved down here because he had an office here and he was spending most of his time down here. He kept an office at 10 Rock too. But I think by the time Frank took over, clearly the center of gravity was here in Miami. But I don't think that was traumatic at all, because it's a very desirable place to live, and I think most people, there are a few dyed-in-the-wool New Yorkers who were not happy with the move, but most of the people enjoyed it. A lot of the reasons people gave for not wanting to move, like advertising, you know, how could you run an advertising department dealing with Madison Avenue 1,000 miles away? If you speak to the advertising folks now, they don't really have any real problem. Same thing with Treasury, with the financial centers in New York. When you're as large as we are, those people find a way to service you. They don't ignore you because you live in Miami.
You had a few years of experience with the purchase and sale of airplanes. In the popular media, during the more recent crises with the airline, that's been one source of criticism, that they bought these new airplanes at the wrong time, or paid too much for them, or too big a debt, I guess is the problem. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, again, that really happened before my time. I think the main focus of that criticism is on the acquisition of the A300s and the 757s. The only airplanes that I bought the 3 DC-10s,
okay,
which we used to go to London and South America, and we were going to use to go to Madrid, but that didn't work out. I think that's Monday morning quarterbacking. I think, you know, Frank and the people involved really performed a minor miracle, given our financial condition, to be able to bring those new aircraft into the fleet. Had fuel prices continued the way they were headed, and I think most people felt they would move, then those aircraft would have been absolutely essential. Today, even with reduced fuel prices, the 757 is still a marvelously efficient airplane and a money maker. And the A300 has proven to be an excellent airplane. Probably the biggest fleet problem that we have today is too many 1011s. But that was a decision made back in 1966. Actually, it was made twice. It was made in 66, when I believe we bought 25, and then in 1968 or 69 we made a decision to buy another 13, and it was that second decision. We never should have bought the second group of 13 L-1011s. But the only criticism that you could level at the A300 by is, given that you had more 1011s than you really needed, as good an airplane as the A300 was, did you need that many more wide-bodied airplanes?
Yeah.
On balance, though, it probably was the right thing to do at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And even today, say now I have the responsibility for scheduling the airplanes, and I really wouldn't want to give up the 757s, and I wouldn't want to give up the A300s. I might be willing to trade a dozen 1011s for a dozen narrow-bodied airplanes, or preferably 24 narrow-bodied airplanes, because I'd like to have some more units to schedule.
What was the problem with the L-1011?
It was a little bit too big for Eastern System. That is primarily the problem with it. They're just, as the industry has become more competitive, there just aren't that many opportunities to schedule a 300-seat airplane.
Oh, yeah.
It's just a little bit too big.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's another thing, again, that's a little bit Monday morning quarterbacking, because at the time the 1011s were ordered, there was a great deal of focus on congestion. And the general wisdom said that you're going to be very limited on departures out of key airports, and therefore, in order to carry the traffic, airplanes were going to have to get bigger and bigger. So there was great focus on wide-bodied airplanes, both from that standpoint and from a marketing standpoint. The conventional wisdom said that once people get used to riding in this spacious environment, they're never going to get back on a 727 or a DC-9. People compared that to the jet versus piston days.
Mm-hmm.
The wide bodies were going to do to narrow bodies what jets did to pistons. That never happened. So there's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking in this business, and a lot of major good decisions and bad decisions are made in the fleet area. The fleet decisions can be critical. Eastern would be a very different airline today had we never bought the 1011s. But I wasn't involved at the time, but I'm not sure that I would have, at least in the case of the initial 25, I'm sure I would have supported that. The second group of 13, I think that perhaps was reaching.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about employee relations? Beginning with, tell me whether there really is a sense of family at Eastern among the employees.
Oh, I think there is. I think there's a great deal of loyalty and feeling for the company. Again, it probably comes from the thing that we talked about initially, that I think a lot of people in this company like working here. They like the industry, and they like the company.
Mm-hmm.
The company has, on balance, treated them well, and they enjoy coming to work. There's an awful lot of people in this world or this country who, dread Monday morning. I don't think that airline people dread Monday morning. Not that they don't appreciate their weekends, but they look forward. It's also the kind of people in this business. The business attracts vigorous, interesting people. And I think that may tend to create what you refer to as family, because you develop a feeling for the company. You want the company to survive. You want the company to prosper because you want to stay associated with it. And I think that's really what family is all about. Now, it is true that we've gone through some difficult times as we've attempted to reduce our cost of doing business. And this, again, relates to deregulation and the pressure put on us. We grew up in one environment. Somebody changed the rules. We've tried to adjust. I think what we've tried to do has hit right at the heart of unionism. On the union side, it's not easy for them to adjust to the new environment. So there have been a lot of developments which have tended to destroy some of these feelings, and yet my feeling is, at least from my perspective, that for the most part it still exists. I don't know if I've given you what you want, but it may not be quite as strong as a company like Delta, who has been, almost paternal in their approach toward employees, very protective, and to a degree, probably in today's world, unrealistic. And I think Delta's in the process of changing. They too are going to have to get their costs down. And they too may find the need to do some unpleasant things which may destroy some of that family feeling. But it's got to be done, because in the long run, if you don't do it, you're going to destroy the family even quicker, because you're going to go out of business.
Yeah, and there's no basis for a family then.
And that's really what all of this has been about. It's been the need to adjust, the need to try to do it equitably, which and equity is always in the eyes of the beholder, so it's very difficult to accomplish. And sometimes things go well, and sometimes, things hit some rough spots, and that's really been the history of the past 10 years.
You see any things that to Monday morning quarterback a little bit, that could have been done differently? It's always difficult when you talk about doing more work and getting less compensation.
Yeah. Well, Frank himself has said that he feels that the one mistake he's made, and I tend to agree with that, is that he probably should have taken the strike in 1983 rather than give the IAM the increase at that point in time. He had valid reasons for not taking the strike, but there was a great short-term risk. Had he taken the strike, he probably realized he was trading it for a longer-term risk, but I think that's human nature. You tend to solve short-term problems and accept longer-term risks, and as it turns out, the longer-term risk turned out to be quite deadly.
Mm-hmm.
But in retrospect, if you had 20/20 hindsight, he probably would have taken the strike and tried to meet the problem right there rather than attempt to solve it over a 3-year period.
If there hadn't been unions at all, like the Delta situation, it probably would have been easier to have solved the problems.
I think so, because I do think that most of the people as individuals understand the new pressures and the fact that keeping 80% of the pie is better than having no pie at all. I sense that some of the problems is that you can't deal with the rank and file directly, that you deal through the leadership, and the leadership has their own goals and objectives, including remaining as the leadership. And it is not easy to lead people to less. And that probably is the greatest shortcoming in this whole scenario, is that we were asking leaders to lead in a way that, had we been in their shoes, we might not have been able to lead. You know, it seems very logical and obvious to us and inevitable, and yet if you're the right kind of leader with the right kind of spirit, you don't give in, you try to accomplish the impossible. And that's just what they were trying to do. They were trying to accomplish the impossible, which is to maintain their compensation levels in a world that wouldn't support it.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, if you ever had a built-in conflict, this was it.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, I don't mean to pin it on I'm not saying that unions are bad. What I'm saying is that, at least in my view, the structure prohibited people from acting rationally.
Mm-hmm. There was some attempt in late 1983 to undertake some studies with some outside experts to see what the real story was behind the financial situation of the company. Is it your opinion that helped? Did that change employees' minds? Did some of them become convinced that there really was a problem? It wasn't mismanagement or.
Well, again, I'll give you my own personal view. I think the studies were undertaken, I think from the union side, they hoped to find huge areas of inefficiencies and opportunities to reduce costs without impacting wages. But the studies didn't find that. So when the answer came back that, sure, there's some ways